Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar panel discussion on urban resilience, what's next for Melbourne. We're hosted today by the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne. My name is Dr. Melanie Lowe, and I'm a research fellow in urban resilience and innovation at the University of Melbourne, and I'll be your chair for this afternoon's event. Thank you for joining us, and just letting you know that the session is being recorded. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners who have lived and loved this country for thousands of years. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose country I stand today, and we also acknowledge the traditional owners of the country from which participants may be joining us today. I acknowledge and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, who are the safekeepers and caretakers of the oldest living culture on the planet. We also extend that respect to Aboriginal people present today. For this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So this webinar launches and discusses a newly published MSSI issues paper, which is entitled Urban Resilience for Local Government, Concepts, Definitions and Qualities. And this has been produced in partnership with the University's Melbourne Centre for Cities and the City of Melbourne. This paper is the first output of a renewed partnership between the City of Melbourne and the University via the appointment of Professor Sarah Bell as the City of Melbourne Chair in Urban Resilience and Innovation. And we're lucky to have Sarah as one of our panellists today. In addition to Sarah and myself, other co-authors of the issues paper to acknowledge are Jessie Briggs and Merrick Morley from the University, and Alyssa McMillan, Marie Grenfell, David Sweeting, Alison Witten, and Nikki Jordan from the City of Melbourne's City Resilience and Sustainable Futures team. So this work would not have been possible without a great group. And links to the issues paper that we're launching today will be posted in the chat, so you can look out for those. I also want to thank the MSSI team for assisting with this publication, especially Katrina Croft-Cusworth for the paper layout and organising this event behind the scenes, and Simone Robertson for proofreading. Now, the concept of urban resilience is rapidly being adopted by city governments right around the world to help them prepare for and cope with acute shocks and chronic stresses. But we need to ensure that cities apply the concept in a way that is practical, sustainable and equitable. The issues paper we're launching today helps build the groundwork by developing an urban resilience framework specifically for local governments, but with broader, potential broader application. So today we'll discuss the concept of urban resilience and how it applies in Melbourne's COVID and post-COVID era. As Melbourne emerges from one of the world's longest lockdowns, what have we learned about urban resilience and what lessons can we draw for addressing future challenges? I'll introduce our panellists in a moment, but first, some information on the format of this webinar. Panellists will address some key questions from me first, followed by plenty of time for questions from the audience. We encourage you to post your questions to the panellists at any time via the Q&A tab, and preferably not in the chat, just to keep them all in the one place. However, we will be holding off answering your questions until later. We'll then have a brief opportunity for concluding remarks from the panellists, with the event concluding at 5:15 Melbourne time. Now, today we're lucky to have four fantastic panellists with us. Firstly, I wanted to introduce Deputy Lord Mayor, Councillor Nicholas Rees, who was elected as a councillor to the City of Melbourne in 2016 and as Deputy Lord Mayor in 2020. Councillor Rees is the portfolio lead for planning and deputy lead for finance, governance and risk. He is chairman of the global men's health charity Movember, and for 10 years, Councillor Rees was the director for the street newspaper The Big Issue. He is an executive at the University of Melbourne and principal fellow and lecturer at the Melbourne School of Government. He has considerable experience in government, having worked in policy roles, including Deputy Chief Staff for Prime Minister Julie Gillard and Victorian Premiers Steve Bracks and John Brumby. Great to have you on our panel, Councillor Rees. Next, we have Joel Backwell, who is the Regional Director for Inner Metropolitan Melbourne in the Victorian Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions. He works across government on the recovery and long-term revitalisation of the inner city with a particular focus on inclusive economic development. Joel works closely with the cities of Melbourne, Yarra and Port Phillip, the Inner Metropolitan Partnership and a range of industry and community representatives. Prior to this role, Joel headed the International Education Division in the Department of Education and Training, and he was previously the Australian Trade Commissioner to Malaysia and Brunei, based in Kuala Lumpur. Welcome, Joel. Thirdly, Andrew Weir, who is City Economist and Director of Economic Development at the City of Melbourne. He is a Victorian Fellow of the Institute of Public Administration Australia and a Director of ARDOC Limited, a children's education charity. Andrew is also an author who is passionate about searching the world for policy solutions that work. In 2020, his first book, Solved: How Other Countries Have Cracked the World's Biggest Problems and We Can Too, was published around the world. His latest book, Recovery: How We Can Create a Better, Brighter Future After a Crisis, has recently been published, which is very relevant to our discussion today. Welcome, Andrew. And fourth is Professor Sarah Bell, the City of Melbourne Chair in Urban Resilience and Innovation at the University of Melbourne. Prior to this role, she worked for 16 years at University College London as Professor of Environmental Engineering. She's a Chartered Engineer and Fellow of the Institute of Civil Engineering. Professor Bell's scholarly work draws on the social sciences to better understand how people, technologies and nature interact to create urban systems. Her transdisciplinary research in sustainability and resilience puts communities at the heart of design and planning. Oh, sorry. In her current role, she works in partnership with the City of Melbourne to jointly foster research and training in the field of city resilience and innovation. So welcome, Sarah. And if I can direct my first question to you, can you please outline the University of Melbourne and City of Melbourne partnership that centres on your role and introduce the urban resilience framework from the issues paper for the benefit of our audience?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mel, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I think the first thing that I'd like to also just direct back to Melanie Lowe is to say thank you and to acknowledge all the work that you have done on this issues paper. Mel read out a long list of co-authors, but she was really the driving force behind pulling this paper together. And as I'm sure you'll see, if you've already read it or if you are planning to download the paper we're here to talk about today, she did a marvellous job. But back to your question, the partnership in urban resilience and innovation between the City of Melbourne and the University of Melbourne was initiated back in 2017, and I was appointed to the role and started in February this year. Now, the purpose of the partnership is to bring research and policy together to address these major challenges, specifically in the context of Melbourne. And the city, the purpose is that the city benefits from having a close relationship with researchers in the university, and we benefit by having collaborators who are actively working to solve complex problems. And it's so far certainly been a wonderful platform to bring together these different forms of knowledge and practice around the table, or this year it's been mostly around the Zoom room, but with the intention to deliver more for Melbourne than either of us could on our own. Now, the issues paper and the briefing paper, which we are here to talk about today, is our first major piece of work together. And hopefully it's an example, not just of the value, but also really of the joy of working together in partnership. Now, at the start of this year, in our slightly nervous COVID pause when we could actually meet together, we were a new team at the university, and the city was also wanting to clarify their approach to resilience, particularly in light of the pandemic. And so we worked with the City Resilience and Sustainable Futures team in a series of workshops and conversations to define what urban resilience means for local government and to provide a bit of a baseline or a framework for moving forward. Now, we didn't invent resilience. It's been around policy and research debates for at least a decade now. But one of the criticisms of resilience is that there are lots of different definitions, lots of different indicators and frameworks and so forth. And this can create some confusion. And then a flow-on risk of that is that resilience doesn't really land as a policy goal or concept because it's hard for policymakers and people, busy people, particularly across local government, to really get their hands and their heads around it. Now, we and the City of Melbourne think that resilience is too important to be lost in these endless definitions and debates. So a clear starting point for our work together was really to provide an updated framework and definition that we could agree, move on, and then start to apply. So we've built on previous academic and policy work on resilience, and we've adapted it into the current context. And in the issues paper, we provide a quick review of the development of resilience thinking and what it means for cities. Resilience is often thought as bouncing back, but the pandemic has really highlighted the need to bounce forward, or we keep hearing these slogans of build back better. In our discussion paper, we talk about resilience in terms of evolution, learning, adapting and transforming, as well as those classic goals of persisting and recovering. And so very much together with the team in the City of Melbourne, we've come to this definition of resilience as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses and systems within a city to adapt, survive and thrive, no matter what kind of chronic stresses and acute shocks we experience, and to positively transform as a result. Now, within that, we've said that resilience has those 4 characteristics, which are really based on that evolutionary idea of persistence and recovery, yes, but then moving on to adaptation and transformation. And there are those 10 qualities of resilient systems, which we can discuss a bit further as we go. People can see them now on their screen and can certainly look them up in the publications. So this framework and the paper and the work that underpins it has really been a starting point for our work together. And we've now got a program of work over the coming years to really support the city in putting some of this thinking into practice, as well as working on our own research ideas like healthy cities and retrofitting cities to respond to climate and biodiversity emergencies. And that's, very much the work that we look forward to over next year and the years to come. And Mel, you're a bit quiet there.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for that overview. And so my next question to Deputy Lord Mayor, Councillor Nicholas Rees, given the impact of COVID-19 as an acute shock and arguably as a chronic stress on the city, what are some of the opportunities you see for Melbourne to positively transform as a result? And you might also want to speak to how we can support positive transformation instead of that returning to business as usual, as Sarah has introduced.
Very happy to, Melanie. Can I also begin by, well, actually, before I compliment you on your excellent paper, I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, which for me, here on the north bank of the Birrarung, are the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'll now do what I said I was about to do, which is compliment you on the papers and the background work that's gone into today's webinar, which I think is absolutely first rate. And just finally, I don't normally look like this, gang. The mustache is, of course, for Movember. So if you're looking at me thinking I'm looking a little bit ridiculous, I'm doing it for a good cause. And so given we've only got 2 days left of Movember, I would encourage you all to support the Mo Bros and Mo Sisters in your life who are out there raising funds for men's health, prostate cancer, testicular cancer, and men's mental health, particularly the focus on suicide. In terms of your question, Melanie, it's a really good one. You know, what are the opportunities that have potentially emerged from this extraordinary, challenging period that we've gone through? Even though I'm the local public representative, I might start from a slightly academic perspective, given this is something I also do at the Melbourne School of Government, and that's to refer to a phenomena known as the Overton window, which is the range of policies which are permissible, acceptable to the public and the political class, actually mostly the public, at a particular point in time. And the interesting thing about crises is that they have a tendency to shift the Overton window so that particular policies which may not have been considered publicly acceptable suddenly can find mainstream acceptance. The second thing that happens in crises is that they tend to spur great innovation as well, as people look to solve problems that they didn't have previously or have to find a clever way out of an acute situation. And so I think when you put those things together, notwithstanding the great pain that Melbourne has experienced over the last 2 years, there is cause to be to have hope and to see that there are in fact some significant opportunities in front of us. And to get a sense of what that might look like, I think you need only look back to how Melbourne has responded to crises in the past. So when there was a recession in Australia in the early 1990s, Victoria was probably the hardest hit jurisdiction, and Melbourne in particular felt the downturn particularly severely. But if you look back, it was also a period from which some great policy innovation came. One such innovation was the establishment of the Melbourne Major Events Company, which really took on the role of seeing events as a major driver for economic activity and to actively pursue major events as part of an economic program. Fast forward 30 years and now Melbourne is the sort of major events capital of the world, if not the known universe, and provides a major economic driver for the city and for the state. The Docklands Authority was also established in the early 1990s. Admittedly, it did take a couple of years to get going after that, but certainly the thinking and the framework for that massive urban redevelopment project came out of the hardship of that recession. And whatever you may say about various planning decisions made around Docklands, and goodness knows I've said a lot, it has to be said, the Docklands has delivered a huge economic dividend for the city, employing many tens of thousands of workers, and meaning that Melbourne, with the Docklands and the Hoddle Grid, has the biggest central business district, the biggest agglomeration of city workers of any place in Australia. And then another incredible innovation which came out of that period was, of course, Melbourne 3000, a real strategic rethink of what the central city is and what it could be. Not just a place for office workers, but a place where people can also live, a place where there's a major entertainment centre and a draw card for people to do all sorts of different activities. It was supported by some really visionary city planning provisions and various support measures, and it was quite transformational of central Melbourne. I think the number of people who lived in the capital city zone back in the early 90s measured in a couple of hundred. Now we have something like 55,000 people living in the capital city zone in Melbourne. Absolutely extraordinary transformation of our central city, making it a 24-hour-a-day vibrant centre, not just something that operated from 9 to 5. So that begs the obvious question, doesn't it, Melanie? And people who are tuned in what will be the big reforms that will come from this period. What are we going to do with now that the Overton window has expanded? For me, I do think the big opportunity sits around resilience and sustainability. I think that there is a sort of coming together of a lot of new thinking around how we make cities more sustainable, more resilient, and I think that new knowledge is intersecting with this period of time where there's a really strong sense in the community that, as Sarah put it, I think she put it beautifully well, it's not just about bouncing back, it's about bouncing forward. So there's a very strong community desire to see that the city does come back better. So for our part at the City of Melbourne, that includes ensuring that there are new building standards for the city. So we've got a planning scheme amendment which we've developed, which is currently with the Minister, which is going to introduce a game-changing shift in the sustainable standards of our buildings. Secondly, it has us setting up new entities like Power Melbourne to help with the electrification of our buildings, installation of big batteries, rolling out of charging stations, and all that transformation which we know is coming and which we at the City of Melbourne want to lean into. And then thirdly, we have Homes Melbourne, which is a new entity we've set up. So again, we can lean in around the construction of community housing, and we ensure that those new major urban redevelopment precincts in Fisherman's Bend, in Arden, Macaulay, that they are truly world-class in terms of being sustainable and resilient, but they're also diverse communities as well that have a strong community housing component to make sure that we have that housing is affordable and accessible to all in our city. So they're just 3 examples. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. So very interesting insights, both in terms of what we can learn from the past and the potentials of the current situation. Joel, I'd like now turn to you. Given your role as Regional Director in Metropolitan Melbourne at the Victorian Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, why is urban resilience important right now? And how might the urban resilience framework in this issue's paper help with Melbourne's COVID recovery?
Thanks, Melanie. So I think this approach that that Professor Bell set out in her paper is, it's important for all of us who care about the future of the city, but I think it's particularly important for those of us in policy development because the challenges we're facing are just so complex. And so we're not going to be able to solve them as individuals and not even as a single arm of government. So I think we need to be really deliberate about building a city at every level that will be able to thrive no matter what's thrown its way. And that does require more than just trial and error. And as I read through the issues paper, that's what really jumped out to me, that a resilient city is one where every part of the ecosystem is operating in sync. And those characteristics of urban resilience that you've set out in the paper, Sarah, like things like persistence and adaptive capacity, I think they're more critical now than ever. It's a VUCA world, and I'm sure many of you have heard that phrase, this uncertainty, volatility, complexity, and ambiguity we're facing. It's not a temporary phenomenon. It's a permanent state. Even now, as we've just taken a breath, it looks like we have a new COVID variant emerging. So we're likely to experience more and more shocks, not just fires, floods, and pandemics, but some of those more existential long-term stresses like climate change or changes to technology and migration, and even changes to the geopolitics in our region that will have a really big impact on an urban centre like Melbourne. So I think what we need, and what I really like about this paper, is a city that's not just buffeted around by these big and sometimes, I think, intimidating trends, but a city that's one step ahead of them and that evolves with those trends. But I think it's going to take a different way of thinking and investing in the long term. And it's normally really hard to get that buy-in. And Councillor Rees talked about the Overton window. In the traditional emergency management space, by the time you get around to thinking about long-term system change, the crisis is over. And with it, the impetus for doing things differently. I don't know, maybe the extended nature of COVID gives us a better chance because the crisis is still right in front of us. And I think we're also in a really unique situation where this particular crisis has touched everyone, not just one group or one segment of the community. But I think one of the other bigger challenges is everyone's just exhausted. That every part of the system's exhausted right now, and exhaustion's not a great bedrock for critical and creative and forward thinking. So we need to be conscious of that. And I think for me, then, one of the most interesting components of your framework, Sarah, is, and I think one of the most challenging, is that aspect of spare capacity or redundancy. It's really hard to sell redundancy to the public because future users of the city don't vote in today's election, to be frank. But also, as we've seen from COVID, it's hard to explain investment in avoidance. So, you know, if you do resilience planning well, fewer bad things happen. And many of the things we've done to avoid the impacts of COVID aren't visible. So instead of saying, hey, look at all the great things government's done to avoid thousands of deaths, you've got a whole group of people saying, hey, look, COVID wasn't so bad, because it's really hard to demonstrate that counterfactual. So building spare capacity is really important, but it's really tricky, and especially for governments. So I think one way we can build in that spare capacity is an individual level. And one of my favourite leadership authors, Holly Ransom, I've been reading her latest book, and she's got this great chapter where she talks about getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, but not just jumping without a parachute. And she talks about how athletes train 98% of the time to perform 2% of the time. But as leaders and public servants, it feels like the opposite, like we're performing all the time and taking very little time to reflect and practice and train for what's coming next. And then we're surprised when we don't get it right all the time. So this concept of evolutionary resilience that's in the paper is really about not just withstanding the shocks and stresses, but anticipating them and learning from them. And I think that idea of bouncing forward, which a few of you have mentioned, really is the right frame. That anything we do now has to focus on what comes next. And as government, there are thousands of things that you can do to support city recovery, but you can't do them all. And so you need to be really deliberate about those trade-offs between actions for now versus actions for the future. And obviously the best actions are those that tick both boxes. So they have a short-term impact, but lay the foundations for the kind of future we want to create. So we're doing some really good things with the city that probably fall into that category of survival, like dining vouchers and Christmas festivals. But for me, the more exciting initiatives fall into that category of system transition. So Councillor Rees talked about sustainable building practices, you know, how we attract new industries into the central city, how we embed outdoor dining in the DNA of the city, and you know, how we create those truly circular economies, and also how we take our diversity and multiculturalism, which I think is our biggest asset as a city, and actually make it the centre of the city's value proposition. So look, these are the elements of recovery that I'm most inspired by. And again, I think that this resilience framework can really help us here, not just to guide our thinking as bureaucrats, but hopefully to create a bit of a shared language across community so we can talk with community about how we recover. So we're not all talking at cross purposes, because it's really easy when you're in the middle of the crisis just to focus on the crisis. And then when it's over, you move to the next one and the next one. And it kind of feels sometimes like you're in free fall. So having a framework like the one that Professor Bell has put together also gives me as a policymaker a bit more comfort. But I've got something to cling to, something sort of tangible to work through the complexity. So look, I'll probably leave it at that, other than to say I've read through the framework a couple of times. I'm already thinking about it in terms of the work that we're doing around city recovery. And I really like the reflection element in the framework, this idea of a whole city thinking in terms of continuous improvement, because I think it gives credence to the trauma of those individuals and businesses who have been hit so hard by COVID, and hopefully gives them some comfort that that trauma is not for naught, and that we're learning something from it and improving on it. And at the same time, it gives us hopefully a way to harness all that excitement around the possibility of a better future, so we can create a city that's more diverse and inclusive and vibrant, and yes, hopefully more resilient than ever before.
Thanks very much for that. Andrew, based on your recently published book, Recovery, which explores previous examples of major global events or disasters, have recoveries from those previous events been assisted by the system qualities outlined in this issues paper? And which qualities of resilience do you believe, based on your historical analysis, might be most valuable in Melbourne's context right now in preparing for the next shock?
Great. Yeah, thanks. And hello, everyone. I think it's important to reflect on where we're at in the disaster management cycle. And for those of you familiar with that cycle, it's traditionally used in natural disasters. We're sort of in the recovery phase at the moment, or arguably still even in the response phase, where we're metaphorically still putting out the bushfires and mopping up afterwards. And recovery, though, is a really important phase, but it also is followed in the traditional disaster management cycle by two further steps. One is around mitigation, and the other one is around preparation. So making sure that we put in place whatever's required to mitigate damage from future crises, and preparing to respond to future crises. And I think that's where this conversation is such a critical part. Recovery isn't just about mopping up afterwards. It's actually all about preparing for what comes next. And I think the system qualities that are in your paper, which I think is excellent, they're evident wherever you look, wherever countries or places or cities have responded and recovered well to crises. You can see those system qualities throughout there. And I want to give you a couple of examples of that just to sort of bring those to life. So for example, I think the biggest one that I really want to highlight, of all the 10, I think the most important for me is being future focused. And I think everyone's mentioned that so far, going forward, not back. And I think, but that's absolutely critical. In every successful recovery I looked at, being future focused is probably the common theme that runs through there. And one example of that is the 1920s, after the Spanish flu, after World War I. You've got this really interesting bifurcation that happens between what happens in the UK and what happens in the United States. In the UK, after World War I and the Spanish flu, they were all dreaming of going back to 1913, before World War I, when they were the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution and the Steam Age, and they were dominating, and they had all of those great institutions, and so the UK really focused on going back to 1913, whereas in the US, where they didn't have that legacy of the industrial age. They focused on going forward to the internal combustion engine and electricity and science and technology. And that really drove them into the decade of prosperity through the Roaring 20s. And I think that is a really great illustration of being forward focused, being a really a critical part of the recovery process. But another example from the United States is the story of New York City after the global financial crisis, or what became known in the United States as the Great Recession. New York went through, it was basically the epicenter of that crisis, because it was so heavily focused on financial services and the banks and all of those big banks that went bust. A lot of them were all based around Wall Street. There were, I think, two of the key system qualities that you highlighted being focusing on lessons learned and diversifying. And essentially, New York City, led by local government, effectively went through a period of reflection, learning about and introspection, examining effectively where they went wrong. And what they discovered was that they were obviously too overweighted in terms of financial services. Too much of their economy relied on financial services, and so they made an explicit decision to diversify their economy in any way they could, to focus on things such as technology, biotechnology, fashion, and tourism, and other sectors like that, and explicitly went down and did quite a number of active things to diversify that economy. New York City subsequently went on then to create 700,000 new jobs in the decade after that crisis, mind you. And they showed that you can recover really well after a crisis. I think another example is in Aceh after the tsunami of 2004, huge devastation. But the rebuilding of Aceh after that crisis, when 500,000 people were displaced, 170,000 people died, it was huge. It's arguably the greatest reconstruction effort in humanity's history. But two of the key, I think, dimensions of that was integrated. So there was a really great system of governance put in place that brought together the national government with regional government and bringing together the efforts of 800 different not-for-profits from all around the world, aligned with a singular focus. So that integration was a really critical part. But secondly, it was inclusive. They made an explicit decision to be community-driven recovery, involving local communities in designing and determining the futures of their own villages and their own futures, an explicit part of that successful recovery. And one more, if I may, Christchurch after the 2010 earthquakes. Christchurch, Central City was devastated, effectively knocked down, and it took a long time to recover. Christchurch grappled with the tensions between a top-down government-led recovery effort and a bottom-up grassroots community movement, and it struggled and it persisted over time to get through there. So that's that sense of persistence. But I think what was really interesting about Christchurch was the focus on innovation, on being flexible and inclusive. And so you saw this fantastic grassroots movement of innovative, creative activity, occupying vacant spaces in the central city with artistic, experimental stuff that was temporary. It was tested out to see if it worked. If it didn't work, they stopped it. If it did work, they kept going. And that sort of experimental, iterative, creative approach really made Christchurch a really exciting place to be, shaking off its shackles as a traditionally conservative city to redefine itself as a place where anything is possible. Fantastic. There's so many fantastic examples, I think, of positive recoveries, and those system qualities that you identify in the paper, I think, run through them all.
Yeah, terrific. I think that historical lens is a really interesting angle to bring to this discussion. Sarah, you've already touched on this a little bit about the value of the university and City of Melbourne partnership. But I wondered if you wanted to just expand a little bit more on the value for the university and your own research on partnership, drawing on your current role with the City of Melbourne or previous work where you've worked closely with other stakeholders and community.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. I think, as I indicated at the beginning, I think it is really important to see this partnership as mutually beneficial, and indeed that together we're serving a higher purpose of contributing to making Melbourne a more thriving, resilient city. On a personal level, this is like a fantastic job. It's incredibly rewarding to be able to do research based in a university with all of the academic freedom that entails, and to do it in partnership with, really a really smart and interesting and dynamic team at the city, and people who are working on a day-to-day basis with, on these kind of really live issues. And it very much is a two-way kind of street. We very much benefit from the cities and their offices and their stakeholders and communities, that way of their forms of knowledge and ways of looking at it, and we bring our own academic research perspectives to that. I think more broadly, again, perhaps historically, but perhaps not quite so historically in lots of places around the world, universities don't always have a great reputation for contributing to their local cities and places. There are plenty of examples of very prestigious, world-leading institutions being surrounded by, a sea of poverty and social deprivation, and, very much that ivory tower not contributing to their local place. And this partnership, as part of, broader strategic discussions between the university and the city, is a way for us as a university to really demonstrate our value to the local economy, our value to helping to solve some of these local challenges, and contributing to that kind of greater, higher kind of social purpose. And I think this connects into more of, again, of a global movement towards the civic university in the UK and in the US and other places, there's this real move to link universities back as anchor institutions into their local places. And this is, very much part of a kind of broader conversation that's going on. So I think our partnership in some ways demonstrates how that can be achieved in one model of this kind of very close relationship between an academic research program and a policy need. And yeah, we're learning as we go, and so far so good.
And then Councillor Rees, from the City of Melbourne side, can I ask you, what do you see as the value from your perspective of that University and City of Melbourne partnership in addressing, I guess, those practical urban resilience challenges that we're talking about?
Thanks, Melanie. Just coming off mute there. Look, I'd begin in the same place as Sarah did by just saying that I think historically universities haven't seen themselves as embedded in their communities. That they're almost actually deliberately went the other way. And if you look at a lot of the architecture and design of older universities, they are designed almost fort-like places where they set themselves aside from the broader community. I have a very strong view that that shouldn't be the place of the modern university, and I'm particularly biased about this because obviously I work at the university, but I also am the Deputy Lord Mayor, and so I guess I'm really passionate about seeing us collaborate more because I can see the scope of the potential to co-create new knowledge, to co-create world-leading research, and to co-create new programs which can lead to better lives, more sustainable city, more resilient city as well. So I really think that, and if you look at some of the great cities of the world, you'll find that they're also university cities, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that there's this real synergy between the academy and the city in this modern era. In terms of some of the initiatives that I'm particularly excited about potential collaboration around, one which Sarah and I already rolled our sleeves up on is around an urban retrofitting of buildings, and just thinking about what we can do to help make those older buildings in our city more sustainable. We've also got a really interesting dialogue going on around collaborative action in climate leadership, just understanding what is needed from a leadership perspective in terms of protecting public health and strengthening the economy. Power Melbourne, which I touched upon before, where we're looking to develop a project to, hold on a moment, to establish a network of batteries across the city and help with that electrification of the city as we transition to net zero. An interesting one on the resilience side of things is Project Night Justice, which involves working with organisations to improve safety of women and gender diverse people at night. We've got a fascinating Aboriginal Melbourne digital mapping project, which is a collaboration between the university and the city as well. We've, for our part at the city, have proposed a First Nations precinct, which we think would be ideally located down on the banks of the Birrarung, and we think that's got huge potential for the city on so many levels. And then look, we've got things as well like the Carlton collaboration, which connects the City of Melbourne with the university and the Carlton Community Network to identify local issues and share resources to strengthen the neighbourhood, which is a really great example of kind of granular collaboration. And then finally, we're getting some great advice from the university around embedding the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. A number of years ago, I went to the C40 conference in Copenhagen, and I was just blown away by how that city had embedded those SDGs in the key metrics of the city. And so, look, I came back to Melbourne like a man on a mission, and I'm really, really keen to see us develop public reporting systems and performance metrics which really do reflect those SDGs. And it quickly became apparent to me that the expertise to do that didn't reside within Town Hall. And so now we've got this terrific dialogue going with the university to help us understand how we can achieve that. And then, look, I'll just follow as well by saying that we also see the universities playing a really, really important role in us fully understanding, documenting, and celebrating and commiserating the history of our city. And it was, it was really sad this week to see the passing of Professor Stuart McIntyre, someone who I have been a long, long time admirer and student of. I'm an absolute history nerd, and yes, Stuart has done as much as anyone to document the extraordinary social history of Melbourne. And the University of Melbourne is not surprisingly the world leading authority on the history of this city, and that's sort of something we want to really see foster and continue as well. So just a couple of points there. I could probably talk all day on this, Melanie, but I'll let today's webinar continue.
Yeah, very interesting. Joel, you've done lots of work in partnership. What do you see as the role of partnerships between governments and with communities and businesses in building resilience, and how do we do collaboration better?
Thanks, Melanie. I haven't always worked in government. I've worked in the private sector. I've worked in non-government. I was a death penalty lawyer at one stage. So I sort of don't come to life as a public servant thinking the world thinks in the same way as we do. Doing collaboration just means listening more and listening better. So, in practice, it means public servants like myself getting out from our ivory towers outside the groupthink and going down to ground level to see and touch and feel what's happening, in my case, across the city. In fact, the stakeholder engagement strategy that I'm working up for my team, we're deliberately calling it a listening framework, not a stakeholder engagement strategy. I said it earlier, but urban ecosystems, they're just too complex to be guided or designed by one group or even one arm of government. I think we've seen the best kinds of collaboration driven out of this pandemic, often out of necessity, but where we've brought coalitions of people together who have just been focused on the best outcomes for the community as opposed to who will get the credit or who's calling the shots. And I hope that long continues. I've been particularly impressed by the energy of some of the social enterprises, and I hope that we can harness their drive for collaboration and innovation even after the crisis subsides. I think good collaboration coming from state government is also really important for coming up with good policies and programs, but it's also important for good implementation, because the best programs are not designed and delivered by state governments in isolation. The best programs are the ones that are co-designed and co-delivered with community. And we know that post-crisis recovery works well where it's community-driven and government-supported and not the other way around. The other thing about designing recovery through collaboration is it's less brittle. It's more open to evolution and continuous improvement, because if you do it well, you create these healthy feedback loops, which means you can keep making adjustments as you go along and hearing from the people who are then benefiting from the programs. But it's really important to understand, and going back to the issues paper, that good resilience requires us to embed those consultation mechanisms outside of the crises, so that when the crisis hits, we're starting from that position of strength and mutual trust and respect, because it's near impossible to build that in the middle of a crisis when tensions are high and there's no time to plan or think. And just to go slightly philosophical for a moment, there's another really important reason why collaboration is crucial. We can debate this in a different seminar, but I feel like we're at this critical juncture in history where we need to fight tooth and nail to build back trust in government and democratic institutions. And for me, collaboration is about bringing people into the tent And so if we do it well, I hope it'll rebuild that trust, so that people feel like they're having things done with them, not to them. And good partnerships are also about a greater diversity of voices. And when we're thinking about a healthy city, I don't just mean cultural diversity and gender diversity. I also mean temporal diversity, in that we need to be thinking not just about current users of the city, but future users of the city, generations that aren't even born yet. And for me, that's one of the real links between resilience and climate change. And I do note that diversity and inclusion are two of the key tenets of this resilience framework that Sarah and her team have developed. And I couldn't agree more, because I think the best ideas come from that confluence of a range of ideas, what some would call the Medici effect for fans of that book, one of my favourites. But also, if we're going to drive a more inclusive recovery, we need more people from a cross-section of the community to be in the room when it happens. And I guess at the risk of making presumptions, as I look across the virtual stage at the three of us, Nick, myself and Andrew, you know, the three of us working at the heart of the city's recovery, I see three middle-aged white men, and I could be wrong, but I think we even all three studied the same degree at university, arts law. So I'd hazard not the best example of diversity, but that's okay. It just puts the onus on us to go out of our way to listen widely, and to proactively bring others in the tent. And that's what good collaboration is. So you asked what the role of partnership is in recovery. The simple reality is none of us can do this alone. And there was a reflection in the study, and I'll get the pronunciation wrong, from Lowe and I think it was Witzman. And I think it's a really useful way to finish by quoting it, because it said, I'll just refer to where I'd written it down. Local governments have a key role in building resilient cities and towns, but they cannot undertake this huge task alone. Individual local governments have limited resources and remit, and comprehensive resilience building requires integrated governance with shared commitment and responsibility, not just across all levels of government, but also the community and the private sector. So in short, I'd say we can't build urban resilience without effective partnerships. It's really central to the success of the mission. But as the sort of state government rep on the panel, I'd be really interested to hear from everyone else about how we as a state government can do a better job of partnering with local government and other parts of the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. And, you know, given the time, I think we'll now segue into questions from our audience. And Andrew, I wonder if you might like to address this first question, which is just noting that climate change, in the context of climate change, we've struggled to trigger that longer term change, and particularly noting that this has been difficult in the Australian context with powerful anti-climate lobby. So the question is, do you think the Overton window that we've been discussing today has expanded enough to spur transformational changes to values and lifestyles required for adaptation in our current time of COVID?
Yeah, I think we've got a really interesting opportunity at the moment. The next decade, and I agree with a comment that John Richardson made earlier in the chat, that recovery will take years, if not decades, from this. The trauma of this crisis is going to play out over quite some time and in many, many different ways. And it's not just all about, it's not going to happen quickly. It's going to play out in all sorts of nuanced sort of ways. So the next decade, I think, is all about recovering from this crisis, but it also coincides almost precisely with the next decade being the critical decade that we need to get on top of climate change and get well and truly on the road to carbon abatement. And I think that does open up a great window of opportunity. If particularly as we're going to be economic stimulus and the economic dimensions of our recovery are going to mean that there is a significant amount of government stimulus money kicking around for many, many years to come. All the economists, there's great consensus about that, is that economic stimulus needs to be maintained for many, many years, and the risk of withdrawing stimulus too early is great. Other countries are using that stimulus to effectively make great inroads on climate change. You know, Germany's investing tens and tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars, as is South Korea and others are, in terms of leveraging stimulus to build, not only tackle the environmental consequences of climate change, effectively not to achieve zero carbon, but to build entire new industries that are actually going to drive the economy of the future. So reframing climate change as an opportunity rather than just as a threat, I think, is a really, really critical part at this particular point in time. And it requires us to start thinking about climate change differently. Climate change becomes an opportunity if we can pivot our thinking so that climate change becomes an opportunity to rebuild a future economy, an opportunity to reconceptualize a better future. That's, I think, the powerful opportunity that we've got in the years ahead. And it's going to require a bit of imagination and leadership, I think, to get there.
Yeah, for sure. We've got another question here, and I can see also a linked comment in the chat around whether it was deliberate for natural systems to not feature explicitly in the definition for urban resilience. And I'll note that there's also a comment about the tricky task of separating concepts of sustainable development and sustainability from urban resilience. And I wondered, Sarah, if you wanted to speak to this about I guess, interlinkages between sustainability and urban resilience and how natural systems fit in.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jared. Yeah, it is a really good question, and it kind of got me on the hop of saying, did we make that decision? And I just can recall quite long and very thoughtful conversations about the connections between sustainable development and resilience. And I think it was, so yes, fundamentally, ecosystems both within the city and the ecosystems that the city draws on in its hinterland and wherever our resources are pulled from, you know, the resilience of those ecosystems is fundamentally important for the resilience and the long-term sustainability of the city. Also, resilience thinking, the discipline of ecology is really important in the underpinning kind of theory and development of ideas of resilience. So it's there, it's certainly there in our thinking. And then, so I think why it's not explicitly in the resilience definition was we see some of that, you know, building systems that operate within the limits, the natural limits of the planet and of our local ecosystems is in that separate objective around sustainable development. So that doesn't go away, but that's kind of the end point. The goal is a sustainable city. And resilience is what helps keep you on track. So resilience makes sure that you don't get knocked out by a pandemic or an earthquake or an economic recession and then default back down to, you know, business as usual, carbon intensive ways of working. So no, it's not there explicitly in the resilience definition, but we don't see this is not the only thing that local government is working on. And so some of those the ecological systems we would see as being addressed in sustainable development goals and other places.
And we've got a question from Professor Lars Kernan, just noting that there was a big emphasis on the metropolitan scale, given those interdependencies, vulnerabilities and opportunities across local government territories in the previous iteration of Melbourne's resilience policy. And the question to our panellists is transformative change towards effective metropolitan governance for Melbourne still on the table? So perhaps Councillor Rees, would you like to?
Sorry, Melanie, I just lost you at the end of that sentence. What's the collaboration?
Is a transformative change towards effective metropolitan governance for Melbourne still on the table when we talk about urban resilience, noting that that was an emphasis of Melbourne's previous resilience policy?
That's a great question that might be best directed to Joel. he obviously oversees the inner metropolitan Melbourne region. I just look after a subset of that in the City of Melbourne. Look, I do think there is considerable scope for improvement of metropolitan governance across Greater Melbourne. Indeed, I think there could be significant improvements made to metropolitan governance across pretty much all of Australia's big cities. In fact, we could do an entire webinar on this topic, and there'd still be plenty left to say, I suspect. Look, a lot of the institutions of municipal governing was set up in a bygone era, and in many regards is no longer fit for purpose. So I personally think there are some activities that are currently carried out by local government that would be better looked after by a sort of greater metropolitan governing body, or even a state government, or indeed in some areas even Commonwealth. Equally, I think there are some areas that I think would be much better managed at a local government level. I'm a big believer in the principle of subsidiarity, and the idea that in a democracy you should push decision making down to the lowest level of, or the level of government that is closest to the government, to the people, while also maintaining efficiency in service delivery. And so particular in areas like planning and in things like building standards, and a lot of the sustainability and resilience initiatives that we've talked about today, I think they would be much better handled at a local government level. And indeed, I think you would find Australia would be performing much better than we currently are on some of those metrics, if in fact we had allowed local government more of a say. Because my experience is that when you get out there in communities and you talk about these issues, you actually find that they lean in a lot more than the politicians at higher levels of government do, and they do understand that the need for some change, and they're prepared to embrace change along with some of the friction that comes with that, because they are accepting of the greater good that can follow. So I guess that just gives you a little flavour of some thinking in that area.
And Joel, did you also have a comment or?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, governance is very rarely the sole answer to any problem. I think part of it, and those debates are going to go on forever and a day and come in and out again like an accordion. But I think in lieu of that, Lars, it's good to see you calling in all the way from Norway. My mother's side of the family's from Bergen in Norway, so brought a smile to see that comment. Short of formal governance mechanisms, it goes back to what I was saying about collaboration. And you can have the best governance in the world, but if people aren't actually coming together, listening, collaborating, and bringing a diversity of voices into the tent, then it's all for naught. The creation of my role, which is a relatively new role as the Regional Director for Inner Metro Melbourne, I would see as part of a response to that, and not just driven out of COVID, but in the longer term to bring a bit more of that collaboration to the fore, because mine isn't a sectoral role, it's a place-based role. And so really looking across government, between government and across sectors. And part of the remit for my role is really to create more of those feedback loops and create more opportunities for people who are far more expert than me in particular areas to come together and share their experiences. I'd probably also point out the existence of the Inner Metro Partnership, and there are 6 partnerships around Metro Melbourne. Again, that's an effort to put in place, I guess, a quasi-government structure that has representatives from state government, local government and community. So there are some steps that have been taken, I think, to acknowledge some of the issues that Lars has raised, but I'd probably finish where I started, that I'm not sure putting in place a formal governance mechanism that's different to the existing one will sort of solve all inefficiencies. And the flip side of efficiency and economy of scale is getting further and further away from local community and the end users of some of the important work that's done at all levels of government.
And while you're unmuted, Joel, there's another question for you posted in the chat about, you mentioned redundancy and the spare capacity aspect and how difficult it is to implement that. What would you recommend in terms of reaching redundancy as an element of Melbourne's resilience?
It's a long conversation with treasuries. No, but seriously, it's I probably couldn't speak on behalf of local government, but I know that it's something that at state government level, there's been a real recognition during COVID of the importance to build in, whether it's redundancy or time for reflection. Again, it goes back to that idea of you don't simply learn on the job by osmosis. You know, there are 1,000,001 studies that have been written about the importance of deliberate reflection. And so the Victorian Public Service Commission's really leading the way there at a state government level, and created more and more mechanisms for public servants to actually come together, carve out time, spend time with each other and those outside of government to actually reflect on what's gone well and what's not gone well over the last 18 months so that we can take those learnings forward. So it doesn't have to be you know, revolutionary or game changing. At the moment, a lot of us are spending, you know, in the eye of the storm, a lot of time doing the doing. Even if you start building into your week 2 or 3 hours to deliberately reflect on what has been and what should come, that can have a really seismic change if you then add up all of those across the public service. So I think it's baby steps first. Rather than anything that's, you know, particularly groundbreaking. And I know it sounds easy and simple to do, but sometimes it is just a matter of deliberately embedding time for reflection. And as I said earlier, not just with yourself and the groupthink that can emerge out of the public service, but deliberately going out of your way to do that reflection with others from outside of government.
And perhaps our last question from the audience is directed to Councillor Rees, noting the tension between planning and certainty. And the question is where politicians or leaders need to sell that the future is uncertain. Can you provide your reflections and any advice for those wanting to overcome that issue?
Gee, that's a great question, Melanie. When you first referred to planning, I thought you meant actually the planning system, but as in our statutory planning system, which governs buildings and urban planning matters. But I believe you're meaning how do you plan for the big changes that we know we need to face up to as a city and as a society. Look, I think it requires relentless community engagement. And, you know, it's a kind of a never-ending conversation. I think people are far more resilient than they're often given credit for. And I think, you know, the story of humanity is one of, you know, people facing big challenges, finding ways of adapting, and then, you know, going on to create societies, communities which are stronger, healthier, and in many ways, and more harmonious, and by almost every metric better than what preceded them. So look, I think it starts with relentless community consultation. I think it starts with honesty, and in terms of the dialogue. And I also think it does require leadership as well. I think you know, it requires political leaders who are prepared to, you know, paint a picture, talk honestly about what the future looks like, and at the end of the day, make decisions that are going to, you know, take the community forward.
Great, and so thank you very much to all of our audience members who have posted those thought-provoking questions for our panellists. In our last few minutes, I just wanted to invite our panellists, perhaps even just in 30 seconds, to add any final messages of what you would like to leave us with about next steps or calls to action to build urban resilience. And Sarah, I might start with you.
Yeah, so I think this is very much a starting point. You know, we're kind of almost at the end of our first year of this new launch of the partnership, and it has been an honour and a privilege, but very much to everybody who's out there. I'm sure there are people from University of Melbourne, I'm sure there are folks from City of Melbourne, but I see this as the starting point for what will be, I think, a broader conversation with folks, other stakeholders, other communities, our First Nations peoples as well, to try and really, look at what this means in practice.
Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, I guess the note that I would finish on is one of optimism. There are, wherever you look, there's no shortage of examples of where places have dealt with crises of the magnitude that we're dealing with, or even bigger, and have actually used that crisis as an opportunity to actually go on to do better things, create more prosperous, sustainable, resilient, inclusive futures for themselves. And I think with the right policy decisions, with the right interventions, with the right reflection, the possibilities for us are immense. And so we should be, I think, incredibly optimistic about the future.
Joel?
I share Andrew's optimism. I really like a quote I read recently from Arundhati Roy in a piece that she wrote about the pandemic. And she said, as we pass through this portal into another kind of world, we will have to ask ourselves what we want to take with us and what we will leave behind. And for me, there's both agency and aspiration in that quote. And I think as policymakers, we really need to build a conversation with community, and to Councillor Rees's point, be really deliberate about the kind of future we want to build, all of us together. I truly think this is a once in a generation opportunity to do things differently, and I hope we don't waste the moment.
And finally, Councillor Rees.
Thanks, Melanie. Look, I just echo really the words of the other panellists by saying, yeah, I think there is extreme good reasons to be optimistic, and I think there's some opportunities before us which I haven't seen before, in terms of the ability to actually take some really, really significant things forward for the city, whether that's, you know, in the power space around Power Melbourne, whether it's around community housing and affordable housing through Housing Melbourne, whether it's thinking about how we move the city from what had been a sort of, I think probably an excessive focus on population growth as a driver for our economy, to a much more productive, high value, smart and sustainable economic model for the city. I think there's huge opportunities in each of these areas, and I'm really, really excited about where the collaboration is currently at between the university and the city as well. I don't think I've ever seen the level of engagement that currently exists, and so I think it's incumbent on everyone who's tuned in today and for all our panellists to not waste a crisis and really make the most of this moment, and yeah, really build the Melbourne that we know this city is capable of.
Some terrific final messages there. Thank you to all of our panellists, Professor Sarah Bell, Deputy Lord Mayor, Councillor Nicholas Rees, Andrew Weir and Joel Backwell. And importantly, thank you to you, our audience, for attending and for your participation and questions. A reminder to everyone that the issues paper and briefing paper can be downloaded, the links that we've provided, and we encourage you to have a read. And with that, I wish you a good evening, and thanks again for attending, and to our panellists.
Thanks, Melanie. Well done.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, panellists. Very enjoyable.
Great.